through, and also how it will affect, your own day-to-day work as a developer. Okay, so some of the changes that we're going to do here, you should see impact how you write your own code. Okay, and so I'll try to help make that connection. All right, so at a high level, table of contents. So first, what is it that I'm talking about? I'll talk about a little bit about some of the problems with our architecture today, the goals for the redesign that I did, and then kind of the process that I went through. And lastly, I'll talk about the outcome, so what the actual redesign is. So the process part will be the longest because I'll go through a couple examples of changes that we've made and how those will affect the developers. The outcome, the actual redesign itself, I won't spend that much time on, but there's a Confluence page that has it in detail. So you're more than welcome to look at that and ask me questions afterwards if you'd like. If we have time, I'll probably go in more detail, but I'm not sure how long this talk is going to be, so we'll see. Okay, cool. So first part, what is this omni-channel? We used to call it ERP. So this, I just wanted to mention briefly, we made a decision to sort of rebrand the product because ERP is very broad, right? So ERP stands for Enterprise Resource Planning. And resource can mean a lot of things, right? Like our HR system is an ERP system, right? But that's not what we're building, right? So what we're building is a retail system, right? Something to sell products on. And it's omni-channel because we allow for online or offline retailers or mobile or web. So that's what omni-channel retail means, okay? So this name doesn't change what we're doing at this point. We know this is what we're doing, but this is just the name for it now, okay? And so I think Ben even changed the Slack channels, but yeah. So that's the ERP versus omnichannel retail naming. Okay, cool. All right. So the next part, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the problems with our architecture today at a pretty high level, and then we'll see some of this further along in the process section about how the changes will improve things. Okay. So one is that systems keep getting rebuilt. Over and over again. I know I've heard many people say, I just finished V1 and V2 is already, being coded. And it's very demotivating when that happens for developers. It's also very unstable for customers, right? If you release a new API every 2 months, then it's a nightmare to work with you, right? Because I have to keep changing stuff. Right? I want you to just stay the same and just, make work, okay? So that's one thing that is a problem. Two, a lot of epics involve like more than 3 teams or like a ton of teams, right? Sometimes this is necessary, but overall, I think we just have a little too many dependencies between the systems. And so this is something that I worry about. Last part, as individual developers, I think sometimes it's hard for you to understand where your system fits in with the rest of the flow because there isn't really. Actually, I haven't seen like a diagram of like what's the high level, overview of all the systems, right? And so that can make it hard for developers to understand like, I'm writing this feature, like how does this fit in with the rest of stuff and how is this valuable? Okay, so hopefully by clarifying some of these, we can fix some of these problems. We won't fix everything. Okay, so design just doesn't fix everything. We are still learning and iterating. I think Ben gave a talk last week or 2 weeks ago. Kind of highlighting this, right? So as we're a small company that's growing, we are still learning what the market wants from us, what will work. And so we have to keep iterating. And so rebuilds will still happen, V2 to V3 changes will still happen. And big epics that, cut across a lot of teams will still happen. But the idea is that hopefully it happens a lot less, okay? And some of the things that we're doing to make it happen less outside of this design that I'm talking about is, in general, we're much more careful about our designs. And so we ask more questions about, hey, what do we need tomorrow, right? Not just what we need today or yesterday, I guess. So we're more careful about design. And at this point, we have a better understanding of market needs. And that's really the key factor in this redesign, okay? So some of the goals for our redesign are to address some of the issues we've talked about, right? So reduce cross-team dependencies, reduce rebuilds, and improve devs' business understanding. And part of this talk will be to try to help you understand how your system fits in with the rest of everything, Okay, so far, I think Ben talked about this at a high level too. But basically, you kind of started off building like a monolithic system, right, to serve Phoneboom. That was like we started doing, and then as we got more clients and learned what other people wanted, we started splitting off pieces of the monolith into microservices to be a bit more agile, right? But this was done reactively, right? So a new client comes in, and then we go, oh no, we got to build this new system to do that. Okay, so now we've done that a couple times, right? We've seen a lot of partners and what their requirements are. And just like when you're coding yourself, you see, 3 different clients need this same functionality. Well, let me write one API to do it all of them, right? But when it first started off, you might not have known all of the use cases, right? So you couldn't have designed the right API from day one. You had to iterate a little bit. Okay, so that's kind of where we are now, where we have seen multiple partners. We've gotten, Masan, now CP, and we had the original Phoneboom requirements, and we have better sense for what that looks like. Okay, and so now what we want to do is try to generalize it. Okay, so that's kind of our goal here. And so the process that I went through was kind of start off with the requirements, right? So define what is the omni-channel retail flow, like what is, at a high level, what does that flow look like? And then we'll break out the key business functions of the flow, and then try to isolate each one, and then define how data flows between these business functions, and then test it out by swapping in client components. Okay, so this is a very, very high level, and I'll get into some examples of what I mean by this. Okay, just so you guys know, when I do interviews with, I guess, L4 plus people, I usually do design interviews. And a design interview, I actually will ask them something like this. I will tell them to design me a retail system. And this is how I expect them to start off if they're good candidates. Okay, so they'll define first the high level flow. Okay, so that's what we're going to start with. We're going to start with the high level flow, and then we're going to start breaking it down. Okay, so at a very, very high level, right, in order to sell something on the internet, you need a front end of some kind. You need product data, and you need some way to manage the orders, right? So this could be, for example, your very first diagram that you draw saying, hey, these are the 3 main areas that I have in my system. Okay, and so what I want to do here is I want to say, okay, well, I know these 3 systems, these 3 functions. Some of the systems that we have now fit pretty obviously into these kind of what I'll call domains or business functions. I'll use those terms kind of interchangeably, right? So the front end domain, right, is where we put all the client stuff, right? Web, mobile, POS, product data. Obviously, catalog belongs inside product data. But the trickier part about doing this design and this kind of redesign, I guess we'll call it, is figuring out some of the harder boundaries to figure out, right? So here, for example, what belongs in front end, what belongs in order management? There's kind of a couple of choices to make. Okay, so I've highlighted one example here. This is the checkout flow currently. It's not complete, but this is kind of the main systems that own the order as it goes through this flow. So from the client, it goes to the cart system. From the cart system goes order capture and the fulfillment router. Okay, so basically what we need to figure out is, or what I needed to figure out was which one of these systems belong into which domain, right? So there are kind of different places where I could say draw the boundary between front end and order management, right? So should that boundary be here or here or here or here? That's what we're going to talk about first. Okay, so where should this boundary have been drawn? And if I draw A versus B, what's the difference, right? Why do I care? So there's a couple of reasons that I'll talk about first. Okay, the boundary between these big domains is what will basically be the entry point for our clients, right? So for example, if we partner with somebody that has their own front end, right? They have their own website and whatever, and they want to use us for kind of fulfillment, right? Then, in this big box, it's easy to see. Okay, that means they bring their own this piece, and maybe we supply just this one, right? Maybe they use their own for these 2, and we only have this for them, right? But the question is, which system are they supposed to call first, right? Are they supposed to call cart, or are they supposed to call order capture or fulfillment router, right? So where this boundary gets drawn sort of determines like which APIs get exposed to the outside world, right? And that matters because when we expose external APIs, those should basically never change. Ideally, right? Very, very rarely should they change, right? Changing those is a big deal, because now all of your external clients have to change, and you never want to make them do that. Okay. Internally, this is kind of similar though, right? So externally, these APIs should not change. Internally, systems should also be calling these APIs that rarely ever change. Okay, and that's part of what's going to give us this isolation between boundaries and reduce the amount of dependencies that we have. Okay, so let me go through some examples. So first things, not everybody here knows what all these systems do. So let me highlight very briefly. This is not complete, but just enough for me to illustrate the example. So at a high level, cart is the one that's going to verify the kind of order information, I guess we'll call it. And the other part it does is it caches customer's cart for future checkout, okay, in some form. All right. Order capture receives the checkout order. It then waits for payment, holds inventory, and then it passes to fulfillment systems. Okay, so the main parts are basically the waiting for payment, and then it's the one that receives the order. All right, so FFR receives an order after it's already been paid, and then splits it into shipments, and then make sure that we reserve inventory for each of those, and then sends to delivery partners. Okay, so at a very, very high level, this is sort of what they do. And so we'll see, if I cut out one of these systems as front end versus back end, what happens. Okay, so the big question is, what do we expect from partners with each of these boundaries, right? So let's say I draw, this where front end, in that high level one, front end here actually just means the clients, okay? And then order management is everything from cart onwards, right? So what this means is that we expect, if partners say, hey, I have my own front end, right? What that means is that we're expecting that they will not handle price promo inventory verification or caching of the checkout cart, right? Because that's what our cart system does. So if they're using our cart system, then they shouldn't do it themselves, right? So this doesn't make that much sense because, well, caching the cart seems pretty damn important for the front end, right? Because if I go to the web page and I come back again, it's not there, then that's kind of a problem, right? So it would actually, the ideal case I've written down here, the ideal case would be to split the cart system actually, so that part of it is the kind of cart caching system and part is the cart verification part, right? Because the cart caching part very clearly belongs with the front end because it's necessary for the front end to function, right? The verification is sort of a bonus, I guess we'll call it, right? But yeah, so this is the implication of drawing the boundary here with our current cart system, okay? And this doesn't make that much sense, right? Because we need the cart caching in the client side. And so it doesn't make sense to draw the boundary here, right? So this maybe makes a bit more sense, right? So cart is now on the front end side, but what does order capture do, right? So now if I say, okay, cart is now part of front end, then that means that we expect partners front end will handle that stuff, okay? So that when they call our systems, that's already been done for us, right? We don't need to verify it again. But what we do need to do for them is we need to confirm payment and hold inventory, right? Again, here it might be better to split this, right, into like a payment part and then like a holding part, hold inventory part, because the payment part maybe belongs more with the front end. But as it is, our partners that have their own front ends probably do their own payment, right? They probably have integration with payment partners to verify and pay for the order, right? So this doesn't make too much sense. Same thing here. If we split it, then maybe it would make better sense. But as we have it now, it doesn't make that much sense for order capture to not be included in that kind of front end domain, right? And this is basically based on what we expect from partners, right? So we expect that most people with the front end will have their own payment system in there, will have their own cart management in there already, right? So they don't need that from us. There will be exceptions, right? Maybe some partner doesn't want to do payments integration, so they don't do that. Well, okay, now that's harder for us. We have to customize something. But the idea behind these kind of big domains and defining this is to say, usually we expect this, right? And we will have to customize for, outstanding cases, but what is the usual case that we expect, okay? So last one is probably the one that most appropriate, the one that we're going with, which is basically I'll cut it off after order capture, which means that basically I expect you, if you have a front end and you want to work with me, I expect that you can take care of payments, that you will take care of verifying the stuff in your order, right? The pricing and the promotions, and then I will handle everything else, right? I will hold the inventory, make sure that it's held for you, and then I will manage the delivery, etc. right? So this probably makes the most sense as we see it now, right? Maybe we're going to get this wrong, though, right? Maybe most people build a website and they don't want to build, I don't know, like a payment stuff, or they don't want to build like cart systems, something like this. So maybe we get this wrong, but for right now, that's our best guess, basically, of what we think the market wants. There will be cases where partners have their own front end, and we think this is the most common integration point that we'll see. Okay. So let me go into a little bit more detail about why these domains are important beyond what I've just said. Okay, so I've already said that they kind of represent major interfaces that should rarely be changed, right? But the other part is that in the future, hopefully near future, we will actually want like what I'll call a gateway for each domain. Okay, gateway is really just like an interface layer over the APIs inside the domain. Okay, and the idea is that this is what we expose to partners, right? So the stuff in the gateway is what we expose to partners, and at the same time, other domains internally are expected to call these same APIs, right? So we will treat everybody outside our domain the same. I don't care if you're external partner or internal system calls, right? Everybody calls my gateway, and I promise not to change my gateway too often, too much. Okay. And so that's very important because this dictates what we expose to our customers. Right? And lastly, hopefully by defining the domains like the exercise that we just did, as developers, you should see, okay, my system belongs in this domain. And so when you get an epic that's like, oh, we need a system that will do this, like you'll know, okay, this is not my problem, right? This belongs in another domain, and this is why, right? And so hopefully defining domains and kind of clarifying where everything fits in will help you know, like, hey, this doesn't belong here, and this belongs in some other system instead. Okay. Once we kind of do this, so the longer term goal here, after we kind of get gateways for all of our major APIs, right? So for example, I can go to the next one. So for example, like this is kind of a more full-fledged one with a couple more components here, but you can imagine, so if I have a gateway for each of these systems, which I draw here, I think, a gateway for each of these that are external facing, now we can start to think about organizing these integrations with third parties and kind of making things easier for people to work with us, right? Instead of right now, it's basically some 6-month-long project before anybody can work with us, right? So the idea is to package these things so that everybody can do it themselves, and kind of manage it even through a UI or something, right? Let me just double check. I wanted to say something here. Yeah, okay, so the idea behind drawing this diagram and kind of telling everybody about this is that I want us to start thinking about this as, this is the flow that I have, right? When a new partner comes in, like Masan, and they say, hey, I have some weird stuff that I need you to help support, right? We should be thinking about, okay, well, where in this flow does that fit? Because you are still a retailer. So what you want fits somewhere in here. So we find the right domain for it. We find the right system for it, recursively. And then we extend whatever that system is to support this new functionality, right? We don't build a whole new flow for that new partner, right? Which is sort of what we did for Masan because we were on a time crunch. But we should stop doing that, right? We should just say, hey, I know this is the retail flow. No matter what you're doing, you have this, right? And maybe you have your own components you want to use for parts of this, and that's fine, right? So we will have kind of gateways set up so that you can use our parts for the parts that you want, right? And you can use bring your own, front end, bring your own order manager system, bring your own like accounting or finance system, and you can plug in with our gateways, right? So that's the idea for this diagram. This is like, takes you 20 seconds to draw, but deciding what goes in each one is where most of the work is. And so that's what I'm going to talk a little bit more about. Okay, so we're going to dive into some of these and talk about within here how we talk about the flows of data between kind of components within this. Okay, so first, we'll dive into order management first to talk about like the data flow, okay, and how that impacts your system choices and kind of coding. Okay, so broadly, kind of order management, as I've described it, is basically handling everything around like fulfillment, right? So you can think about these four I've kind of written up, but you could think of dividing things slightly differently if you wanted to. But so I've envisioned that there are kind of 4 subdomains in here. So there's some order management system, and then there's like after I get the order, I need to make sure I have inventory, and I need to make sure I can get it delivered. And then I need to, after I've already sold it, sometimes I need to support, for example, like cancellations, or maybe I send them a voucher after the order is complete. So there's some kind of post-sales stuff that happens, right? So this is what I roughly envision is there's these 4 components or 4 kind of main functions that happen within here, okay? And the question that I want to talk about here is, how does the data flow between these systems, right? Which systems call which systems, right? And it is similar to the idea of, where the boundaries should be for the domains, right? Because this will decide, which subdomain is allowed to call which other subdomain, which means like, you can expect different things, okay? So as a first example, this is one possibility, right? So I have basically a order manager subdomain that serves as a coordinator, right? And basically, the order manager will call out to the inventory subdomain, ask it to hold inventory, and then it will, receive the reply. And then it will call to delivery, say, hey, go deliver this stuff for me. And then it will receive a reply. And then we'll call post-sale management saying, hey, I'm done. You see if there's anything else you need, right? So this is one possible design. Right. So in this case, what's nice about this is if somebody wants to bring their own inventory system, right, all they need to do is just plug in and replace this box, right? And then the order manager can just have a config for, hey, if you're a seller number whatever, you can call your own inventory versus calling ours. Okay, so that kind of if else is pretty simple, right? Or if you want to do your own delivery and you want to use our warehousing or whatever, then you can do the same thing. Okay. So this sounds reasonable, and that's why I want to talk about an alternative, okay? And this is actually still up for discussion, actually, but this is an alternative, right? So in this case, order manager isn't quite the central coordinator, right? Inventory and delivery kind of are almost like, from order manager's perspective, it's like one subdomain, right? I'm calling this guy and I'm waiting for this guy to reply to me. So for me as order manager, this is really one kind of component, right? And this is different than the other one, because if a partner wants to have their own inventory management, it's a little harder to integrate now, right? Because there's this outbound call and the inbound call are coming from different places now, right? So if I swap in a partner's inventory management, then I'm in their inbound call, they have to go call this other system, and it needs to be compatible here with the delivery subdomain, right? So this makes it a little bit harder to bring in just a single component. On the other hand, it makes it a lot easier for people that, if inventory and delivery, they want to use both their own systems for these two, then this is a little bit easier, right? Because they have one integration point, right? Receive from order manager and reply to order manager, done, right? In this case, if our partner wants to use their own inventory and their own delivery, now they got to integrate with 2 different endpoints, right? And it sounds like a small thing, but as a client, I guess half the amount of work, right? I don't have to do so much work. And that actually does matter in sales, right? When we talk to partners that, want to use our systems, if it takes them too much work, takes us too long, then they're not going to do it, right? And you lose business, right? So trying to get this right and saying, okay, we think most partners that have their own inventory will have their own delivery, right? If that's what we think, then this one makes more sense, right? If we think that people might want to just have their own logistics and delivery, or just have their own warehousing without the delivery, then this one makes more sense, right? The other case is about data flow, right? So in this one, inventory and delivery don't talk to each other, right? That means that I'm assuming that delivery doesn't need anything from the inventory subdomain to do its job, right? That's the only way this works, right? If delivery usually needs information from inventory, then this doesn't make sense at all, right? Then we should do this one, okay? And so these kinds of decisions basically decide, okay, so if you are working on WMS, right, which is clearly an inventory part, right, how often does the delivery partner need to make a call to WMS, right? And what is it for? Is it possible to route it through order manager? like this, right? So WMS just tells order manager, and then now WMS doesn't have to care, right? I don't care about your delivery partners, right? In this case, you have to care because they're going to call you, or you're supposed to pass information to them, right? So this kind of decides how you should run your own system if you're within one of these domains, because now you're not allowed to call basically this other subdomain. Okay. So this was kind of an example of the data flow, how these connections. Sorry, in the high level one, these connections are pretty fixed. I mean, they're not much to argue about. When you get to lower levels, this is what I'm referring to as a subdomain. But then when you get down to the system level, like which systems calling which systems, the reason that becomes important is because the more callers you have, the more clients you have, the more dependencies you have, right? So when an epic comes along that asks you to change, hey, I need to add a field to the order object, right? Now it's a big deal because you got a ton of people using this order object, a ton of clients using it. And now you have to coordinate across like 6 different teams, right? So even just agreeing on a one-page design probably is going to take you 2 days, just because you have to talk to so many people, right? So if you had isolated it like this, for example, now nobody cares about order objects except these guys, right? Inventory just knows, hey, I just know inventory. Here, if inventory has to talk to delivery, then inventory needs to know about orders, right, in order to facilitate the delivery of them, right? And so now you have to make more changes for anything that involves an order. And this is sort of what we have now. And so that's why all of the epics that involve changing back orders or holding inventory, those things take like forever because there's like 50 teams or 50 systems that have to get touched, right? So if we are able to do kind of more isolation, that will hopefully get reduced. Okay. All right. If people have questions, by the way, just type it into the chat. I'll hear it ping, and then I can answer it. Okay. Cool. All right. So next, let's dig a little bit further into subdomains down to like the systems level. Okay. So one of the changes that I want to talk about is one that we actually did do in the design, and so I want to talk a little bit about why and what some of the impacts are. Okay. So again, these are like these subdomains that I mentioned earlier. Inventory is a particularly big one. There's a lot of stuff in it, and so that's the one I want to dive into. Right. So right now, this is roughly how we have the systems organized. Okay, there's inventory subdomain, I'll call it, which has a bunch of these systems, and then this subdomain sort of talks to these external partners via a connector. Okay, so what's good about this is there's a connector, right? From internal to external, we want some layer that's kind of doing the conversions and maintaining a static API for external people, right? And then internally, we can do whatever conversions we need to translate it into internal calls. Okay, so this flow is sort of what I'll call internal to external, right? All the internal systems, this connector, and then all the external systems. Okay, the problem with this is this flow is not related to how the business actually works, right? The business doesn't work internal to external, right? It works in the flow that I just showed you, right? You need to hold inventory, you need to go do delivery. Within inventory, you need to go check your different partners to see who has inventory and assign it to them, right? So this internal to external has very little to do with the business. It has a lot to do with the technical side, I guess, right? Because these are systems that we build, these are systems that other people build, and then this is a connector. Yeah. This makes it very bad, right? This makes it bad because when I change one business function, so when I change, for example, oh, I need to change the way I hold inventory. Well, now you have to go across all of these systems because you haven't isolated that functionality, right? What you've done is, you've basically done internal to external, but hold now exists internally and externally. So you kind of have to make changes everywhere, right? And that's what happens now, right? So right now, because we organize like this, when you make a change, these epics end up changing tons and tons of systems. Okay. So what you want to, one way to think about this is like, who cares about inventory, right? So up here, right, order manager is the one. Let's say we go with this design. Okay, order manager is the only person that cares about inventory, right? Does Order Manager care if it's an internal or an external system that's, organizing inventory? No. All Order Manager cares about is, do you have enough stuff to fulfill this order? I don't care if it's in a partner system one. I don't care if it's Tico's own warehousing or Eaton or whatever. Just tell me, do you have 5 pencils or whatever you need? Right? That's all Order Manager actually cares about. Right? Doesn't care about the warehouses. Doesn't care about internal, external, all that stuff. Right? So it would make a lot more sense to just have all I care about is the aggregate inventory level. Right? That's all external people care about. Nobody outside of this subdomain needs to care about the details of it, right? Just give me the total, right? You have 10 pencils that we can sell, great. I don't care where it's coming from, okay? Internally to inventory though, you need to care about it, right? And so that's the way that you should organize it is, or one way you can organize, let's say, is aggregate versus individual, yeah? And the reason is because nobody outside this domain cares about individual. They only care about aggregate, right? And so this is sort of the design that I'm proposing we go to is to reorganize the system in terms of the aggregate versus the individual providers. Okay, and so drawn a bit more detail with kind of connectors in place. So connectors is basically what we want between any internal versus external system. So that part still exists, but you'll notice here that I have a Tico warehouse connector, right? This is not external, right? WMS is not an external system. But and this is sort of an optional component if you want to, but the idea is basically like the aggregate should not give special treatment to the individuals, right? It should treat all individuals as equal. And the Tico warehousing is just one of those individuals, okay? And this makes it nice because outside of inventory, none of these systems should talk to anything else outside of this one component. Right, and all external people should only talk to these systems. Right, nobody should speak to WMS, SRM, none of these systems. Okay, why is that good? Well, if nobody calls you, you don't have to worry about them. Right, this means that WMS doesn't have to care about changes in the accounting system. Okay, unless there's a change in this interface. Right, so if you change this interface, then all of our partners have to change. Right, that's a big deal. Right. But the good thing is, unless that changes, you don't have to care, right? And same thing the other way around, right? No system outside of these guys need to care if you change anything WMS, right? So I don't have to worry about it because the only thing I care about is, do you have 10 pencils or not? Yeah? Now, the downside of this is that you're not allowed to change this interface that often. Yeah, you can like cheat, right? And have, let me just WMS not go through the connector and just call, this other system directly. Like, because it's internal, yes, you can do that. Okay. And there will probably be cases where we have to do that for something. Okay. But ideally, right, you conform to this and it saves everybody a lot of headache when you need to make changes. Right. The other nice thing though is if we do need to change this interface because we have some case where WMS needs to pass some information up, that's if you build it into this interface, if you're forced to build it into this interface, then anybody else can now use it too, right? Our partners can now use that. And chances are, if Tico's own warehousing needs it, somebody else probably needs it too, right? And so in that way, we kind of build more generally, okay? Obviously, that means it takes more time, right? You can't just hack it and have WMS just call this other system directly. But the payoff is that it's more generalized, right? And hopefully saves us some hackiness. Okay. Oh, how are we on time? Okay. Well, we're actually really good on time. All right. Cool. So this was the last kind of part of the process that I wanted to talk about in terms of hopefully you guys have a better understanding of like what I'm talking about when I talk about this kind of high level redesign. And hopefully you guys have a slightly better sense of how it impacts you, how it might benefit you, and how it might also make your life more difficult in some cases. Because some things, like I said, right, will be harder to do. Because I don't want you guys hacking stuff where WMS now just calls some of the system directly, right? I want you to pass it up through these layers, right? And so some of those changes will make things more painful for you, but the benefit is hopefully that when you need to make changes, most of the changes we need to make will not be huge, okay? That's the hope anyway, assuming we get these right, okay? So I'm going to briefly talk about the actual, I guess, redesign. You guys can go, I've linked here the Confluence page. If we have time, I can go through it a little bit. But please feel free to look at it and then message me with any questions you have or concerns. Basically, if we think about that high-level diagram from the beginning, I've finished going through with most of the leads about the order management domain and the accounting and finance domains. The other stuff, I don't really anticipate big changes, so I haven't really made a big effort to talking to the teams and redesigning anything here, because I think most of it's pretty okay. There is some possible things we could do with product data, and maybe staff front ends, like dividing seller versus platform a bit more cleanly or something like that. But I don't expect major changes, so I haven't really prioritized looking at it. Okay, but the other ones, the accounting and finance changes are actually very simple. Let me just flash that on screen, because this relates directly to what we were just talking about. One moment. So the accounting finance changes that I expect are actually related to that last point that we were talking about, where we want to basically isolate WMS, and actually OMV2 should be in there too, as like the kind of what we'll call the TICO provider, and kind of shielding that from the other internal systems, right? You must come in through the connector kind of thing. Okay, so oh, this is very, very small. Okay, so this is currently, and thank you, Cho, for drawing this. I'm sure it took him forever because there's so many events here. Basically, this is the finance system, or the accounting system. No, this is the finance system. Yeah. Okay, so this is the finance system, FMS, the financial management system. And basically right now it just receives a bunch of events from different services, and then supports some web apps for querying as well as input, and then also some apps for just querying. Okay, and so the key part of this is basically this one, right? So who are these people that are calling FMS, right? So you'll see here right away, like a WMS, OMB2, and so you should expect, based on what I just said, that this should not be here, right? And I haven't talked about logistics, but yeah, this is similarly for logistics potentially. And the accounting, same thing. The accounting service has basically import-export events, right? So anytime the warehouse receives or exports product, as well as their WMS also does some invoicing, which is not good because WMS is a warehousing system. And so that's another part that I haven't talked about in this talk yet, but those are the two main changes. But you'll see basically here, like WMS OMV2 are calling accounting system. Now there's a world in which this makes sense, okay? And that world is if nobody else needs accounting, right? If nobody outside of our internal solution needs our accounting services, then in reality, this accounting service almost like lives inside the TICO provider, right? And in that case, it shouldn't come in through the connector, right? Because it's not a generalized thing, right? It would make sense for the connector to separate these if we want to use the accounting for more than just our own warehousing. Okay, so that's kind of the distinction between should I go through the connector or should I effectively allow this direct call, and basically accounting system is now part of that TICO kind of warehousing domain that I mentioned earlier. Okay, so the changes for the finance one are a little bit more straightforward. So basically, instead of WMS, this event that was previously coming from WMS now it comes in through a billing service, and there's actually a flow change there, as well as the events that were previously coming through order management, the OMV2 system, which is sort of being repurposed as the TICO warehousing. It now comes in through order capture, which is like the generic kind of order management system that we use now. Okay. And on the accounting side, the current thinking is that the accounting will serve more than just our own warehousing. And so the events from WMS should flow through the connector. This, I guess we can still talk more about. And then there's kind of a separate, some of the events will come in through billing service. So you see here that these invoice events that previously came from WMS and make no sense there should be coming in through the billing service instead, right? And so hopefully with some of these changes, the systems will get a bit more isolated. You won't, especially for WMS on V2, hopefully you won't have to be involved in like every single epic that involves an order, right? If you live behind the connector, you don't have to care about anything except changes to the connector, right? So these are the two for accounting and finance. These changes are pretty small. The ones on the order management / kind of like fulfillment systems, which are mostly owned by the Ho Chi Minh City teams, there are some more changes there. But it's mostly what I said before, like changes in at the very beginning, right, where I said like this kind of change, right? Like, so from A to B, like your system belongs in this domain versus that domain. Okay, those are most of the changes that we're doing, as well as dictating a little bit more like which domain can talk to which domains. Okay, so the current, Tanya's comments here. So the current one, let me zoom in a little bit. Oops. 200? Yeah, too big. Oh my gosh. Fine. Okay. So hopefully you guys can see this. But so this is the current way that the systems are organized, and Omni has drawn these domains, which are in blue, right? So order management, inventory management. He's drawn a supply management domain, external warehouse versus TICO warehouse, external delivery versus kind of, I guess we'll call it transportation management. So these are kind of the domains that he's thinks about when he's organizing the systems. And he's sort of at a disadvantage here because it's oops, sorry. Yeah, so he's sort of at a disadvantage here because the arrows are very messy. But in my defense, he drew this diagram. I didn't draw it. But you can see here, right? So fulfillment router, fulfillment connector are in the middle of everything, right? So any change that happens across any of these systems will touch both of these systems. There's no way around it, right? On top of that, like WMS talks to a bunch of systems. Warehouse aggregator should talk to a lot of systems, so that's good. But basically, right, we want to try to cut down arrows where we can, okay? He's also drawn OMV2 in red, so we're supposed to deprecate this, etc. But that's like kind of detail. And so largely the domains that he's drawn make sense to me. I've made some changes to them, but mostly they make sense to me, right? My main concern is basically how many arrows are here and how many systems have like a bajillion arrows coming out of them, right? That's what we want to try to cut down on, okay? So I've cheated. I haven't drawn the arrows between all of the systems. But the idea is that between each domain, you should not have like system calling system almost, right? Ideally, hopefully not in too far in the future, we should have a gateway over each of these domains, right? So you'll have an order management gateway, okay? And all of your clients will call this order management gateway. And so there will not be any of these system, like, system in here calling the system in here, right? It will just be system in here calling a gateway, right? And then now I don't care what happens in your domain as long as it doesn't change the gateway, right? And so this is actually the flow that I said earlier, where kind of order management is a coordinator layer, right? And kind of it can talk to inventory management, reply, and then call delivery separately. Again, I don't know if this really works. We're still trying to figure that out. But if it does, there's nice benefits that we talked about earlier, right? And you see here what we talked about earlier, where TICO warehouse management is just like any other warehouse management system, right? And nobody else in the system talks to them except this kind of aggregation layer, which we're calling the inventory management layer, right? And that's nice because now these systems don't have to worry about anybody else changing. They don't care, right? And the other way around too, right? If order management fulfillment router makes some big change, WMS should not have to care, right? Or if it does care, like everybody should care together, right? So that's the idea here. You can see, so this is some of the new things as here are the TICO versus external, like we mentioned. I talked about the post-sale management domain earlier. These services are kind of being spun out of OMV2, so we're breaking up OMV2 into smaller pieces, partially so that we can do this, right? So that we can isolate domains a bit more cleanly. Otherwise, every change happens in OMV2, which is not great. Okay. So this is most of what I wanted to go through. I didn't want to go into too much detail about this. Let me answer Tyne's questions really quickly. So Tyne said, Okay, so I think we answered some. Okay, so we answered his first question here. How do we group these services into a module? Well, that's the exercise that we did at the very beginning, right? Trying to figure out, what is appropriate. And basically, the driving requirement was, what do we expect partners to need, right? Where do most of them want to integrate with us, right? And that should be kind of the edge of your domain. And then will they talk directly or through each module gateway? So they should talk to the gateway. So basically, if you are outside of my domain, you are all treated the same, right? Whether external or internal, doesn't matter. And this other question, so I think the ERP versus omnichannel is really just a renaming thing. It's not actually a change in what we do. Okay, but he is correct in that most of this is the back end stuff, mainly because I don't expect big changes on the front end. I think most of that stuff is, you have an iOS client, then you have to have an iOS client. So that's the end of it. Okay, cool. So I think we are at a pretty good time. If anybody has questions, so we've got like 10 minutes for questions. Hopefully that wasn't too fast and too furious, but please let me know if you guys have questions. Feel free to type them or talk directly into the room if you'd like. I guess it was too fast and furious. Okay, cool. So like I said, so there's the slide here. Oops, slide here has a link for the Confluence page, which has a bit more detail about some of the design choices at the domain level. And as you guys, hopefully you guys think about this yourselves and think, hey, I really disagree with what you said about order capture. I think it should be part of the kind of the order management domain, which is actually where I drew it first. The reason I added this set of slides is because actually Tian, our CTO, said, hey, I don't think order capture should be in order management. I think it should be part of front end. And so we talked about why. Like we spent like a couple minutes talking about, okay, why do you think it belongs there and why I think it doesn't belong there. And so that kind of prompted me to add these slides in, because I think that was a really really important discussion to have about which systems belong into which domain. Okay. Cool. All right. That's all. Oh, Zoom had a question. How does service policy? Okay. So service policy has two components, I guess, right? So part of it is integrated within the client. And then part of it also has the staff portion. And so the way I would draw this is really that it is part of what I'll call product data. But basically it's like the, yeah, okay, guys, I haven't drawn every system, right? especially the Hanoi side systems, because I don't expect those to change that much. Okay, that's why. But so the service policy system is the one that is supposed to end up telling us, like, which, what kind of delivery services we have, or what kind of installation or repair services we offer with the product. So that system probably belongs inside the product data layer, because it's something that shows up in there. There's an argument to be made that it should be separate or something like this, and so that we can talk more about that as well. But the reason I say it should be that is because right now the way it works is kind of similar to product data. The customer front ends receive information about it, and the staff front ends, you can configure it. But then the service policy doesn't talk directly into the fulfillment systems, right? That passes through the customer front ends. Whether or not that's right, it's something else that we can talk about. But the other part is, these big components, the way to think about if you should care about your domain is, do we expect a partner to bring their own, right? At what point do we expect a partner to have their own? Right? Nobody's going to come in with just a service policy system, right? It will be part of probably their product catalog, right? And that's why I say, okay, maybe it probably belongs with the product data. Sorry. User service is, Lynn, why you call it? Yeah, I know that. Okay, fine. Yeah, we'll get to that part actually. So Kian's question about the service, user service. So the user service sort of lives outside of this a little bit, we can sort of consider it part of like a product data, I guess. But yeah, it's sort of outside of this actually. And maybe it should be a whole nother domain, right? But the question is basically, do we expect a partner to either want to bring their own version of this, or is there a partner where they would only want this from us, right? And it's possible that they would, right? So one thing that Tien has talked about is, hey, we should, sell our search capabilities, right? So a client can give us their catalog, but we sell them we provide the search functionality for them, right? So one day, if we get really good at search, then that's something that we could sell as a service. And in that case, that deserves its own domain or gateway or whatever you want to do to package it, right? So the user service stuff, yeah, maybe one day we need that to have its own domain because a third party may want to integrate with us to get user data and use it for something, right? This is basically Google's like bread and butter, right? That's what Google does, is they have a bunch of user data that they monetize in different ways. Yeah? So if we get to that point, we can try something similar, and that would make sense to have kind of a domain for the user service, right? But yeah, so like I said, I cheated. I haven't really done the Hanoi systems or even thought that much about it. I did think, yeah, probably don't change that much stuff, so I didn't think too far past that. Lynn saying, yeah, catalog has a call to SRM. Yeah, so I hate that call. So that's why there's an epic to get rid of that call. Right, but the right way to do that is, catalog, part of catalog's job should not be to tell the warehouse what they have, right? It's sort of strange and backwards, right? They should almost be pretty separate, I guess, right? On the one hand, it's do you have inventory? On the other hand, it's does the seller, sell it? And you need both to actually list it, but they don't need to coordinate. Cool. All right. Any other questions? All right. I think the thing I'm most proud about is the timing of the talk, since I never practiced it, so I didn't know how long it would take. I'm glad it's worked out. But cool. Thank you to all of you guys and girls for listening. Hopefully you learned something. Please let me know if you have feedback, if you have questions, or if you want to, me to follow up with something. Please let me know. Okay. Otherwise, I think that's where we ended tonight. Okay. All right. Thanks, guys. Bye.